here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned. Immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the writer critic and cultural music historian. It's the one and only Audrey Golden, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. A couple of years ago brought out a book, or written a book titled I Thought I Heard You Speak, Women at Factory Records. That came out 2023, which was fantastic. Her follow-up is called Shouting Out Loud, Lives of the Raincoats. And this is, obviously, as the title suggests, everything you needed to know about the Raincoats and so much more. Yes, it is available from all good bookshops online. It came out on White Rabbit Books, so do check that out. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the background and reason for writing a book of this on this particular topic and subject. Anyway, you'll find out much more. Audrey, it's over to you.
Yeah, I had been a fan of them since I discovered them, thanks to Kurt Cobain, as a lot of people of my generation did in the 90s. And I was just really excited to hear women playing music, singing, and I was especially excited in the 90s to hear music that was really playing with violin and experimenting with violin in a whole new way. I was classically trained on violin. My parents didn't really have a lot of money for my violin lessons, but also kind of forced me to keep taking them. I felt really uncomfortable about the whole thing. I hated playing classical music. And so when I heard the Raincoats on the kitchen tapes, I was really excited by it. So I'd been a fan for a while, and I actually interviewed Gina, Birch of the Raincoats for the Women at Factory book because she'd made a number of music videos for New Order, which are really great. And I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if there were like a big Raincoats book that played with like experimental storytelling, but also told their story in a way that was really true to all this incredible music. And so as I was wrapping up the Women at Factory book, I approached the members of the band and asked if they would be willing to sit for interviews with me for a book if I were to write one. And they said they would need to see a proposal first. And so
Yes.
I didn't have a proposal at this point in time because it was just, kind of an idea. Normally you wouldn't even, go through like the work of writing a proposal unless you knew, you could get the or at least some of the interviews you needed.
Yes.
So I put together a proposal and I gave it to them, and I guess they sat down with it. I don't know what exactly happened behind closed doors with that proposal, but they came back and said they'd be willing to sit with me for interviews, sorry. And so I started interviewing them and working on the book and kind of fleshed out the proposal a bit more with my agent. And yeah, it went from there.
God, that's fantastic. I mean, it's kind of an interesting period. I mean, to be honest, I was a little bit too young for that punk period, but something that one goes back and sort of starts to sort of search through different sort of musical periods and genres. So sort of, are you able to just put in a bit of a context of when and how the band sort of came together in that sense of, obviously it's well documented, that sort of, the pub punky period with people like Doctors of Madness and then what was it? I suppose it was Dr. Feelgood, and then sort of obviously punk is this kind of big thing that happens in 76, 77 really, isn't it? And then obviously this kind of opens up a big kind of moment for other bands to start sort of having a go. So are you just able to sort of put a little bit of a kind of context of how the Raincoats come together?
Yeah, absolutely. So Gina of the Raincoats, one of the two co-founders, actually happened upon the first Sex Pistols gig, which is just wild, while she was hitchhiking around the UK, to visit art schools with her friend Alex. And they happened to be visiting St. Martin's when they caught the first Sex Pistols gig, first ever. And I think that really inspired Gina to start thinking about punk in a new way. And then it was really seeing the Slit, for both Gina and Anna, who were at Hornsey Art College at the time together, seeing the Slits that really gave them a sense that, yeah, we could start a punk band, we could do this. And at that point in time, I think they were more kind of colleagues than close friends, Anna de Silva and Gina Birch. But they were seeing shows together, seeing gigs in and around London. And that Slits gig was really important. Gina ends up bringing the Slits to Hornsey to play a show. And shortly thereafter, she and Anna decide to start this band that they call the Raincoats. There are a number of incarnations of it. And it's also cropping up around the time that Rough Trade is really coming up in West London too. And Rough Trade's really important because Rough Trade creates this community of punk, post-punk, kind of experimental artists that are all inspired by this kind of punk boom in a way, but don't necessarily have a shared sound at all. Instead, all the bands kind of have this shared ethos that you can make music you want to make, and you can do it your own way, and punk is really what you make it. And they also have a shared kind of sense of feminism and egalitarianism that Jeff Travis, the founder of Rough Trade, really shares. So the Raincoats come up in this time and start experimenting themselves with making music alongside bands like Pere Ubu, Stiff Little Fingers, and others who are all signing to Rough Trade.
Yes, because it's kind of interesting, because I think there was the thing about the 70s in the UK, and I do remember sort of quite a few bands. So it was also Fast Eddie from Motorhead. I remember doing an interview with him and him saying when they started in that sort of mid 70s, late 70s, you know, I mean, his phrase was, you didn't have a pot to pee in or something like that. Everybody was so broke. There was absolutely no money. Politically, the UK was going through this huge amount of kind of different prime ministers, different governments. There'd been the 3-day week. Everything felt very grim and sort of quite horrendous. So there was a lot of, I mean, the community, I always think there's a massive thing about the community aspect at this time. There was a lot of squatting going on. There was a lot of people poor, but also with the student times where a lot of people were students, mainly because being a student, it's like, well, I'm not going to get a job because there aren't any, so let's just be students. You also got a grant at that point. So you got your tuition fees paid. Then you got this money, which was like, my God, we've got all this money. Let's blow it in the first week on a guitar. So there was that element as well, wasn't, I sort of... I remember in the 80s more than the 70s because I was a bit too young, but having sort of heard people's stories, there was this element of, well, let's do this because the world is going, we're going to hell in a handbag. So that also helped people. Yeah, well, I think with punk, because there was also, just to ramble on a bit, there was also the prog rock world, wasn't there? And all this very and heavy metal, and there was a lot of men being very serious on Top of the Pops and on the old grey whistle test. So suddenly there was this kind of avenue, wasn't there, as well, which kind of opened up for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. And squatting was a really big part of the Raincoat story, too, because Gina was squatting in West London. She was living in a squat. She had gotten her room from the artist Neil Brown, who became a really close friend of hers. Richard Dudansky of the 101ers with Joe Strummer was squatting in a building essentially next door. And he was living with Esperanza Romero, who was the sister of Paloma Romero, better known as Palmolive, who was the original drummer of the Slits. And so those connections were helping to kind of get the Raincoats off the ground in different ways. Richard kind of got them into their first gig at the Tabernacle. But the squatting life and squat life in London also just, even though it was, I think dirty and there weren't a lot of, I guess, elements of modern living.
No, I think yes, yeah. I think it's kind of though it's slightly romanticized, it was, but it was also slightly grim as well. I mean, I do remember sort of people, photographs of people living in squats in Leeds, and you're thinking, wow, you didn't want to do that for too long, but you didn't have to pay any money, and at the same time, I think also what also was quite interesting during some of that period, again, sort of into the 80s, is that there was a lot of balls boredom. There wasn't much to do. So it was like, well, what should we do apart from go to the pub for happy hour? So there was kind of an element of, well, let's just form a band. It wasn't like, oh, there's so many things. So I think that also helped a lot of people have a go at stuff as well.
Yeah, and I think being in art college, like you mentioned before, and sort of seeing all these different ways of making art, um, helped to helped artists to think about music as a form of art, and it I think really inspired Anna and Gina in a lot of different ways, and some of the other people who were squatting, and that lifestyle definitely gave them the ability to have time. And to make music since they weren't having to really pay for where they were living.
So
Definitely.
with putting this book together, did you get a sense that there was real kind of quite strong communities that developed within these kind of moments of history and sort of musical creativity, in the sense of like community centres, studios, rehearsal space, gigs and things like that, when people sort of get into meeting, networks as well. Did you get a sense of that from doing the book?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, around the squats in West London, squats in other parts of the cities, around rough trade in West London. But then, if you've read deeper into the book, around Olympia and around the venues and kind of spaces in Olympia, Washington, where the Raincoats took on a new life a little bit later on, sort of unbeknownst to them. Also around gallery spaces in the later 90s and 21st century. Yeah, so I mean, I think that kind of definition of community comes to mean a lot of different things in different places and at different times, but certainly different forms and really important elements of community that definitely come up and that help a lot of artists to kind of come together and to get to know one another and to work with one another in different ways.
And did it take long for the band to go from that sort of early period where there was a different lineup to their kind of classic period? Was that quite a tricky period for the band, or did that sort of work quite well? Because obviously they didn't probably have a complete manifesto at the beginning, but there must have been a sense of, gosh, we could be an all-female band from their initial lineup.
I think there was strangely never really a sense that they wanted to be an all female band. I think it kind of happened that way because their initial lineups certainly weren't all female lineups. Like I mentioned, Richard Dudansky was involved. Came to be in the band at different points in time, but wasn't in that initial lineup. But initially, they had Nick Turner on drums, who was really young at the time, but went on to play with Lords of the New Church later on in the 80s, which is kind of wild to think about him as a Raincoat. They had Jeremy Frank, who was a woman, an American architecture student who was kind of glam, I think, at the time, according to different memories. She played guitar in the band to start when they started gigging. And for different reasons, Nick and Jeremy left the band. They had some different lineups. They ended up with Vicky on violin, and Vicky was part of, if you want to call it a classical lineup, I think, or the classic lineup of the Raincoats. But then I think that was really just the three of them, Anna, Gina, and Vicky, in those early years, because they had a range of drummers. They did have Palm Olive, who came over from the Slits on the first EP and LP. But Palm Olive wasn't in the band for long at all, actually. Ingrid Weiss, who was their drummer later on and actually wrote the initial kind of version of the song Shouting Out Loud that ends up on Audie Shape, she was actually in the band for a longer period of time than Palm Olive until she got fired from the band. And then they just had a kind of wild range of drummers. So if there was a classic lineup, it was probably the three, Anna, Gina, and Vicky. But I don't know if there was any such thing ever as for the Raincoats as a classic lineup, as it were.
Yes, because there was a lot of kind of important books and films that brought that sort of feminism to the mainstream during the 70s. I sort of remember things like watching the Stepford Wives, and there was a Marilyn French book, which was The Women's Room, and then there was obviously Germaine Greer. So feminism was really, I mean, had sort of bounced from that 60s into another generation who took it another step forward, another group of young women who obviously going to university in various places were getting very interested in sort of quite a lot of different subjects and sort of questioning mainstream society. And obviously, if you watch a lot of television from the 70s, I mean, it's horrendously sexist, isn't it? And awful, so crass. And it was also dominated by men as well. So there was kind of a huge amount of change that was going in the 70s. I mean, it did get very messy at times as well with, obviously we sort of find out that sort of, companies, there was an awful lot of sort of sexual harassment. Obviously the BBC, that wasn't a good period for them either, was it? It was a real male-dominated society, wasn't it? And women were still looked upon as a sort of a bit of a sideline, and sort of, on top of the pots they used to have, was it Pan's People, that people, oh, that's good for the dads to watch some young, scantily dressed women dancing around. So the 70s did have this kind of rather horrendous, sexism, really, with Page 3 on The Sun. So there was a lot to get angry about during that period as well.
Yeah, and still, I think, but
It's not perfect, is it? But you only have to dip back to the good old days, going, oh my God, that is horrendous. I can't believe that person's just been, I don't know. Recently, I suppose I do watch a lot of these kind of interviews with people, and they were just talking to, Oliver Reed. He's like, do you like women with brains? And not really, dear. I don't, I'd rather them just look like hot totties, and thinking, with Michael Parkinson and people, you think, oh my God, that doesn't seem long ago to me, but, it is 50 years. But at the same time, it was just like, yes, it's like, it was almost like the Stepford Wives, isn't it? It was that kind of feeling. So there was a lot of anger that came out from the feminist movement at that point, because there was a lot to be annoyed about.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think, for the Raincoats, Vicky was certainly involved in a lot of the feminist groups that were doing activist work around London. But I mean, in the book, I talk about how Anna really didn't like to call herself necessarily a feminist or call the Raincoats a feminist band. And I think they had different reasons for that. I think for Anna, it was never, about being overtly feminist, even though she certainly was a feminist in, kind of all definitions of the term. But for Vicky, that was really important. And I think they came from, different backgrounds, and they had different reasons for sort of thinking that way. But I think maybe in retrospect too, it's more important to think about the Raincoats and their feminism because of some of the things you bring up from the mid to late 70s that are really heinous. A lot of that stuff really continued, I think, into the 80s, into the 90s. I mean,
Oh yes, it
into
was.
the 2000s. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah.
I'm sure you must have watched Woodstock '99 to think, oh
Yeah.
no, the '90s started so well with Kurt Cobain, and then finished with, oh wow, that's what happens when you're not paying attention, isn't it? So in a short space of time. So yes, it's very tricky. You have to be careful at all times, which yes, if only we were. That's always true. So when the band started to record, then what was their process like? Was there particular strong characters who took the lead? Was it Gina and Anna who were particularly the two main people that drove the band at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think they always saw themselves as the main figures of the band, but I think Vicky too, in those early years of the band, the kind of first life of the band that I write about, that's really about making those three records and the first EP from which they became known. But they really went into the studio and just kind of, by all accounts, just recorded live. There wasn't really too much finagling in the studio, and they just really went in and played as they'd been practicing. And so, for all intents and purposes, that EP, Fairy Tale in the Supermarket from 1979, the self-titled LP from the same year, and then the follow-up LPs, Audie Shape and Moving, really just were about going into the studio and playing. Moving is a little bit more polished, and the studio engineer, Adam Kidron, I think was a little more interested in getting a polished sound at that point. And at that point, by 1983, the band's really not getting along. There's really a real sense they're not going to keep going together, and they have to kind of, get talked into going back into the studio to record. So you really do have kind of Anna songs and Gina songs at that point in time. And so I think that's a reason for the kind of different sounds on the records. But yeah, I mean, through that first incarnation, they really go in and just play in the studio and record it as they play it.
Yes, I can't remember actually. My memory's not that good. But at that stage when they start to record, are they doing the band as a sort of full-time thing, or are they still students during the day and then musicians at night and at weekend?
Early on, they're still in art college, but they're largely not working jobs, at least not full-time jobs. Anna's working behind the counter at Rough Trade a little bit, but they're mostly playing in the band, and yeah, early on, still going to art college.
Yes, because I love the book, and there's so many things about it. Because they go to is it Space Ward Studios in
Yeah,
Cambridge, which is
yeah.
again one of those studios, which I do remember sort of having to track down this sort of producer or somebody to do an interview with on my other on the show, because it was just fascinating because the roster of bands that had played there were just amazing. This was a little studio in Cambridge. Was it the one that was still in the sort of town, or was it? Had
Yeah.
they moved by then? So
No,
this was
yeah, it's in the town, yeah.
So who was the producer on that particular recording?
I mean, technically, Jeff Travis, and but I think he uses the term producer lightly.
Yes. And did
And
they did they enjoy going into the studio as a band? Because some
yeah, they
people
did.
really enjoy it and other people find it hard work and just a bit boring and a lot of time waiting around. I just wonder if they were one of those bands that developed to be sort of comfortable in that environment.
Yeah, I think they did like it. And none of the studio sessions in those early years were very long at all. They basically used time in space word that was excess and overnight from Stiff Little Fingers. Stiff Little Fingers didn't use up all their time, so the Raincoats used that time. And then they recorded the first two LPs at Berry Street Studios in London, and with Jeff producing and Mayo Thompson of Red Crayola producing. And yeah, it still didn't take that long. They just kind of went in and played, and I think they enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah, and at that point, was that sense, because as we sort of truck towards the end of the 70s, I mean, this is kind of an interesting period in British history, I suppose, because we get Thatcher comes into power, and then sort of the next decade, the 80s, which looks quite glamorous now, but actually at the time is quite grim, because then we sort of have the Falkland War and the miners' strike and Greenham Commons, so we all think we were going to be nuked. So there's a massive movement at this point. Was this kind of all impacting sort of on the Raincoats as they were sort of on their musical sort of chapter themselves?
I mean, I think it's really hard to separate anything happening like socioculturally uh, from like to sort of untether those things, right? And politically, like social things, cultural things, political things. I mean, in my mind, like they can't really be pulled apart from one another. So I think they were impacting the Raincoats in the way that those things are just necessarily intertwined, even when people say they aren't. I think they are. But the Raincoats weren't talking, with me specifically about those things.
No,
I don't think they were. Those weren't kind of key things for the Raincoats to bring up.
no.
Yeah, and a lot of the kind of more political elements in the book, like the letter that I found in their fan mail from the Irish political prisoner in the Troubles who was imprisoned in Northern Ireland. Uh, those a lot of those political things are really me drawing those out. I mean, that's where I think my kind of my own background and kind of experience as a thinker, scholar, writer comes out because my background, I can't remember if we talked about this last time, but my background's in kind of international human rights law and cultural studies. Before I started writing about music, I got a law degree and a PhD in literary studies. So
Right. Yes.
yeah,
No.
so
I,
a lot of those kind of those political factors and kind of key political moments. I see how those, must have been influencing bands and influencing people doing cultural work and artistic work. But those aren't things that the Raincoats necessarily brought up specifically in me talking
Yeah.
to them. Yeah.
It was just sort of interesting because, there is this kind of grimness that kind of
Yeah.
one sort of remembers from the 80s when you think, oh, yeah, actually, we didn't wake up every day going, oh, it's the 80s. This is amazing. People are going to reminisce about this in years to come. It was all like we all groaned and went, oh, no, this is all grim. We've got Thatcher, they've got Reagan. It's all getting very tense. There's no money. There's the yuppie. There's the unemployed scroungers. There was
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff that was going on, and it was just, I suppose, it kind of impacted a lot. And I mean, did you find, with sort of doing the book, the Raincoats start to have a massive impact, not on people decades later, but at the time, because obviously, like I mentioned, a lot of culture is kind of, it's the boys and the men get the sort of, the publicity. But for a lot of people, the Raincoats must have been really an important band for them to sort of latch onto or sort of relate to at that stage, because we had sort of like the Marine Girls, didn't we? There was the Dolly Mixture, who just brought out a book as well, and there was kind of that kind of slightly lo-fi indie sound, because Cherry Red Records brought out, was it Pillows and Prayers, around that time, this double album, which something like Pay No More Than $1.99. It was like full of, these very sensitive and odd kind of artists. So I think sort of the independent artist became somebody who almost could get a platform into not mainstream society, but certainly get a voice in society as well. And I just think the Raincoats must have played a big sort of part in a lot of people's formative years at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what is so interesting about the Raincoats and thinking about that is not how they did that directly in the UK in the late 70s and early 80s, but how their music started to circulate in North America starting in the early 80s um, and really made an impact there in that kind of way that I think you're thinking about. And ultimately came back to the UK and had the same kind of reverberations there for UK Riot Grrrl bands and indie bands kind of coming of age in the late 80s and early 90s. But what's most interesting to me about their story, or one of the things that's most interesting, is the way that their music started to circulate sort of unbeknownst to them. And they were having this impact on soon to be Riot Grrrl artists who make an enormous and critical political and cultural splash in America, queercore artists who make an incredible political and cultural splash in North America, and sort of bring that back over to the UK in the 90s. So I think the Raincoats had some really dedicated fans in the 70s and early 80s in the UK. But I think in terms of the kind of power of their music and the power of their both sonic and actual voices actually happened across the pond.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because I think on the back cover, you have a quote from, is it Patty Shelmer? Is that how you put
Schimmel,
it?
yeah.
Schemmel, who
Yeah.
was obviously the drummer in Hole. And because when I sort of mentioned I was on I do the C86 show, she said, oh, I remember that cassette. And I was like, really? And she knew all the songs on it. And I was like, wow, that is, and she said, oh yes, that was a massive thing. And I thought, gosh, in that days, we hardly had landline phones and there was no computers. So it was interesting how, America managed to pick up on all this indie stuff. But there was that kind of curiosity because we had 3 weekly music papers, didn't we? The NME, Melody Maker Science, and then John Peel as well. And I think there's always that curiosity, because being in England, Britain, during that time, if John Peel played anything in America, I'd go, oh, yes, I must like it, just because it's a long way away and it seemed very exotic and everything. So, my critical awareness went out the window. So it was like you just wanted to latch on. I just wondered if that was was it a nice kind of change from what was going on in America at the time, hearing bands like the Raincoats and just that indie scene, that kind of, wow, what are they doing the other side of the Atlantic?
I think there was a lot going on kind of locally in different places in the US and in Canada at the time, and in Mexico too, in North America generally. But I think it was thanks to a handful of kind of local public radio stations and college radio stations, chaos KAOS, in particular in Olympia, Washington, where John Foster was just really interested in building a library of, indie music, of independent music that was experimenting with sounds in different ways, that was doing something a little bit different than like classic rock radio that we think of now, right? There wasn't classic rock radio, but those kinds of stations that are playing the music we think of as classic rock radio, and wanted to really create a library for DJs to put on shows that were playing music outside the mainstream bands just doing kind of traditional rock and roll, whatever that means. And so I think it was really exciting for people who were both making their own music, but trying to find inspiration in other indie artists to hear stuff coming out of the UK. Absolutely.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, because I was just thinking, because this was a kind of a slightly interesting, well, it's an interesting time. There's the punk, and then there's post-punk, and obviously there was the what was it, new Paisley sound, there was goth, there was electro music going on, with electronic kind of synthesizers happening. There was psychobilly stuff, but there was also that kind of that period as well of like not quite knowing what to do. If you didn't want to be the Gang of Four or the Fall and Marky Smith and people like that, there was that kind of other, yeah, I mean, the Smiths came along in '83, so I found that from '83 to '87 there was definitely a indie sound that sort of became that umbrella. But before that, there was a little bit of a sort of not a grey area, but there was kind of a sorting out the decade almost. And I suppose with the Raincoats, there was that kind of element of where do you sort of fit in? Probably a few years later, they would have gone, oh yes, you'd have definitely fitted in under indie pop. But before that, they were sort of a bit pre that. And Rough Trade must have only just, how long was Rough Trade, or had they been going at that stage when they signed the Raincoats?
They had been around for, I mean, not very long. They had formed relatively recently, but I don't want to misstate the year.
No, let's not
But
do that.
relatively shortly before the Raincoats became one of their bands. I mean, the Raincoats records were some of the early releases on Rough Trade, absolutely.
Yes, I think that was like, yeah, I just had a look. It was about 76, 77, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah.
when the band went to record their second album, what was the general vibe of the outfit at this stage? Because it's always kind of interesting. The first album can be a bit of a honeymoon period of, wow, that's incredible. And then the mechanics and the kind of the industry that you suddenly find yourself in of promotion and touring and then dynamics and then working out whether you've signed a good record deal or not and the publishing rights. What was it like for the Raincoats? Were there any more lineup changes at this stage?
So they had been touring with drummer Ingrid Weiss, and Ingrid had brought Shouting Out Loud to the band. Um, Obviously, a song I think is really kind of a crucial Raincoat song since I titled the book with it. But by the time they actually started recording, they had fired Ingrid. Ingrid was really young at the time. She was a teenager. And I think there were like clashes personality wise with someone so young, even though she was an incredible drummer, a really incredible drummer. And I think it's a big what if they'd kept her in the band. But as a result of that, a lot of the rehearsing and writing some of the other songs for the second album, Audie Shape, they did without a drummer. So it was Vicky, Anna, and Gina, largely
Right.
in Gina's squat and in Vicky's squat, just kind of playing, rehearsing, and writing songs together. And so they ended up bringing a lot of different drummers in to play when they were recording Audie Shape, including Robert Wyatt, who came in and sort of just improvised.
Yes.
Yeah, and they brought Ingrid back to the studio to play some of the songs she'd worked on specifically. And yeah, so it was it was quite different from the first
It
album in that
was, wasn't
regard.
it?
Yeah.
It was like the Spinal Tap of drummers there, because they had Robert Wyatt on one, Richard on one, then
Hmm.
Charles Hayward
Yep.
on two, and then
Yep.
Ingrid on two as
Yep.
well.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes. What did you sort of make of all that kind of? Because normally a band's a little bit more consistent, even if they are having a few. Were they quite tough cookies at this stage?
I don't know if they'd say so, but I suspect yes. Yeah.
Gosh, yes, I hadn't realised Charles was in there as well. He was
Yeah,
in the
yeah, yeah.
mix.
Yep.
Yes. So when it came to the kitchen tape, which was this is the live album that they put
Yeah, the kitchen
together.
tapes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right, so that's quite straightforward, and that's a regular band. So when they came to do Moving, this is
Mhm,
their third and
mhm,
final album.
mhm.
So this was, yeah, so what was the state of the band at this stage? Sort of 84. There's a great period of music, actually, isn't it? 83 to 84. It's like I mentioned, the Smiths had formed,
Mhm.
and then there was this kind of like, there was a sort of a lovely period of bands that had really started to sort of come together. And for me, I suppose this is when I became obsessed with John Peel, and there was just some great sort of musical vibes. What was it like for the Raincoats at this stage?
So the record comes out in 84, but they weren't together after 83. They recorded in 83. They recorded the record in 83. And honestly, essentially, after they did the kitchen tapes in New York City, which they recorded live in December 1982, they were really on the verge of breaking up. Um, when they all came back together to the studio to record Moving in 83, the band really wasn't together at this point. Like I mentioned, they really had to get convinced to come back into the studio to record their songs, and they did. But I don't think there were any, illusions that the Raincoats were going to continue after this. So uh, they were really starting to think, beyond the Raincoats at this point. They came in, recorded their songs, but that was really going to be it. They were moving on, as it were.
Did they ever have a moment where they kind of sat down together and all agreed, or how did the band sort of come to sort of that conclusion? Was there any definite moment, or was it just personalities that just weren't quite sort of in tune anymore?
Yeah, more of the latter, and just a number of different things going on in their lives that I think it had just become really clear, like this isn't going to keep going.
Yes. And then so what's the next part of the book for you then? So how do you then, because then this is this the they just go away, they pretend it never happened, I'm assuming, as you do when you sort of things don't end well. Did they when they started finding they were popular again in the 90s,
Mhm.
well, how does the band then react to all these kind of like mentions and conversations about them? What's their response to that?
I mean, I think they were really excited and invigorated by it. They reissued their first three albums on CD. They got back together to play. At first, the idea was just one show uh, to celebrate the reissue of the CDs on Rough Trade in the UK and on DGC Geffen in America, which is wild. For anyone who doesn't know, that's the indie major label. I'm putting that in scare quotes because it's a funny
Yes.
kind of oxymoron. The indie major, but the huge record label of Nirvana, basically, puts out their CD reissues in America, and they end up getting back together. They end up touring again. They were supposed to go on tour with Nirvana, which is absolutely wild. Kurt Cobain takes his life. That idea comes to an end. But they do end up just crazily signing to DGC to record a new record, and they record their fourth and final studio album, Looking in the Shadows, which comes out in 1996.
Yes. And just on that point of
Mhm.
the major label, because very few people would probably appreciate it unless they're old like me. But signing to a major was like, it was career suicide for us angsty indie kids, wasn't it? Because there was big news when Sonic Youth decided they were going to sign on a major, and it's like, oh my god, can
Yeah.
they really do that? We
Yeah.
don't like Sonic Youth. Oh, actually, that's quite a good album. Perhaps I'll just have to live with that one. So it's quite a big thing, that world between the indie and the major. Just as a point, I suppose, because now we would think that's ridiculous to be so uptight about it. But then, being on a major
Yeah.
was different, wasn't it? It was quite a big thing. So when they got that sort of repackaged, did they get some financial sort of benefits with that and sort of more exposure at this point?
I think that was the idea. I think the idea was that they would get more exposure. And for what it's worth, Sonic Youth's major label signing was also DGC. Um, uh, so all in the kind of DGC family there. I think the idea was that they would get more exposure, but the record didn't end up doing as well as they wanted it to. I don't think the CD reissues perhaps ended up doing quite as well as anyone hoped they would, although I think they circulated. And the Raincoats largely didn't have a good time making that record in the studio. They didn't have a good time with DGC. And even though there were some really great people working there, Ray Farrell, who was the A&R person at DGC, was really supportive of the Raincoats. And but it just there were a lot of struggles, and interpersonal struggles with the band too. Gina was feeling more left out because Vicky didn't want to come back to join the band again. So Shirley had been a longtime manager of the Raincoats, but she and Anna had also been together for a long time. And so Gina often felt like kind of the odd person out. Shirley and Anna didn't feel that way, but there were just a lot of kind of personal things going on at the time too. And so it just wasn't going to last, I think. And they broke up again.
Yes, it's really interesting in the book. You talk about that a lot, about this kind of I mean, because as a fan, you always think, oh, that's going to be marvelous, isn't it? And then you read it and you think, oh dear, it's just one of those things that I know a few bands that, they must regret ever reforming. I think a band called Lush reformed because they had a great offer. And then, yes, they do the American tour and it's just a disaster, isn't it? Interesting story on that one. But yeah, so this is quite interesting because because in the book you mention about that dynamic, and also the producer that they brought in as well, Ed Buller as well, and also the famous, and this is something that I've come across with a lot of people doing interviews, the famous click track that appears as well, which is another thing that sort of pushes people kind of over the edge as well. Do you want to just kind of explain a bit about the famous click track and why it can push drummers into states of, I don't know, desperation, if not suicide, really, isn't it?
I'm not a drummer, so I don't know that I can speak directly to that sort of experiential knowledge. But what I can say is that the click track is something that really isn't customary for bands that really have experimental qualities, especially experimental percussion. I mean, it's designed to keep a really steady and uniform rhythm. And so that was the opposite of kind of what the Raincoats were. I mean, they've talked at length about how, they didn't keep a steady time. It was never 4/4, even if they started 4/4, it ended up something else. And Gina has talked about the drums being kind of like a heartbeat, sort of following along to whatever kind of emotional, experience the band was having at any given point in a song or while recording. And so they bring in Heather Dunn to drum on this album, and Heather is the drummer for the fantastic band Tiger Trap, a K Records band that's one of my personal favorites. So if anyone listening doesn't know Tiger Trap, check out Tiger Trap. Heather had also drummed with Lois, the kind of stage name of Lois Maffeo, who was a really critical artistic and cultural figure and musician in Olympia, Washington at the time. So she comes over to record with the Raincoats and to create this album with them and to record with Ed Buller in Trident Studios, which is a big fancy studio in London. And she gets in the studio and she's told she's going to play to a click track. And I mean, essentially she's like, what the fuck? The Raincoats and a click track? This doesn't make any sense. And so that gives a sense of, I think, the difference of the recording of this record versus the earlier records that Jeff and Mayo were producing, that Adam was engineering, and that the Raincoats were kind of more in control of.
Yes, and just that kind of point, it's, I don't know if you managed to catch it. There was that a film about the wedding present that were making the album George Best, and there was a whole thing about the drummer being removed during the session because of the click track and the producer, and it was just as an indie kid, you just think they just go in, bash it out, and what you hear as an indie kid is like, oh, that's fine. You didn't realise there was this kind of trauma that was going on, and the producer, and sort of lots of dynamics, and that was kind of interesting. And then people like Lindy Morrison from the Go-Betweens, again, the end of that band is almost to do with the click track, and also Patty from Hull is also kind of removed from the musical project because of a click track. So it is quite a big thing, isn't it? The studio, that studio moment for a drummer, the pressure is just huge. I mean, I don't appreciate it as a punter. I couldn't imagine it, but I could see that tension start to mount when they don't get it, and the producer saying, "Well, if you want a hit record, you need this kind of beat, and if you want to make it rubbish, then don't, just keep with that," and everyone's like, "Oh, what do we do?" So it's just kind of an interesting bit, and it comes out in the book that it's like the band aren't enjoying it as well as at this point as during that process, which is
Yeah.
quite interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Ed Buller was really great, right? But he also, it's complicated because he has this job to do for this indie major label to produce this record in a set amount of time, and to, attend to what the band wants while also recognizing that he has to earn a living by producing for this label. And so it's I think kind of a big complicated mess in a lot of ways. But I think the record's actually really great. It doesn't sound a lot like their earlier stuff, but there are some amazing songs on that record. I especially love Don't Be Mean, which Gina made the music video for as well, that you can find on YouTube. So yeah, I encourage people to check that one out. I really love it. I listen to it a lot.
Yes, and also you in the book you talk a lot about the album cover and the dress. Do you want to just explain that? Because
Yeah.
again, it was something that I sort of hadn't appreciated it until I sort of say read. I listened to you talk you through this, but it was like, wow, this is an amazing story, which was boggling. Do you want to just explain about this, the cover for this album and this incredible picture and the dress?
Yeah, the cover's a photo of a memory dress. And Anna actually wore the memory dress in a photo shoot done by Maria Moknash, who is PJ Harvey's longtime photographer. And at that same time, in that same shoot, sorry, not PJ Harvey, but Maria Moknash shot Gina in a flesh dress. And you can read about both of these in the book, but I'll just talk briefly about the memory dress since it's on the cover. It's made of metal, wire, and the idea was to put memories in the dress, to kind of clip different memories and hang different memories from Anna and Gina onto the dress. And inside the book, you can see Maria's photo of Anna wearing that dress, but it became the cover for Looking in the Shadows. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting and meaningful cover in that way.
Yes, and does it have a lot of, because you talk a lot about it in the book, about the the history and the origins of the memory dress. Do you want to just explain a bit more about it? Because I thought it was just a sort of fascinating kind of part of the chapter.
Yeah, it's been used for different reasons in different periods of time. It's been used as a kind of object of mourning after a person dies to create a memory dress. It's been used as a way to kind of keep a family record. And it's tied to this idea that women are doing these, making domestic items like dresses. And women tend to be the keepers of those stories. And so it's tied to all these kinds of histories and different fashions, to indigenous histories of familial and community record keeping, to, family record keeping in different parts of the UK and in different parts of the world. So yeah, it has a really interesting history.
Yes, and then do the band, that wasn't a great experience. Do they then sort of reform and start to play live again at this point, and sort of, because obviously because you talk a lot about a lot of the fans that start to sort of mention. I mean, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because there's a few artists who had a moment, say in the 60s or 70s, and that's it. And then a famous person. There was a particular person called David. I was going to say a particular person called David Bowie. I remember David Bowie suddenly in the 90s started talking about a particular a band he remembered in the 60s, and they just happened, like they were a very early prog band, I suppose, but they broke up in the late 60s, and the keyboard player just smashed his equipment and said, "That's it, I'm never playing music again," which he did. And then people kept sort of hearing this name of this person and the band, and suddenly he was going, why are people kind of interested in it? And no one's contacted me for about 3 decades. So it was interesting that the Raincoats start to get more and more traction at this point as well, isn't it? And that must sort of lead them to sort of re-evaluate their sort of early career as well as the legacy that they brought to sort of popular music, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I think they're starting to think about that in the 90s. They are playing and they play gigs through 1996, but then they stop playing together again. I think they really start to think more about their legacy maybe in the 21st century when they start getting invited to play museum openings, different types of kind of retrospectives, and feminist exhibitions that lead them to kind of realize the power of their music for so many different artists and in different forms and genres and mediums too.
Yes, and that's so with when you sort of started to put this book together,
Mhm,
and you started sort of collecting and collating
mhm.
all these interviews, did you have a sort of particular idea of how you wanted the book to feel and the shape of it?
Yeah, I knew I didn't want it to be a straightforward music biography. I wanted it to be something different that spoke to the kind of experimentation of the Raincoats music, but that also showed how their music, unlike some other bands, really took on interesting lives of its own. So that's part of what that subtitle's about. It's not just about the specific lives of the members of the Raincoats or the experiences that the band had that they can talk about, but it's about the lives the music has had over time and in different places. And so I really wanted to showcase that and to use that idea to think about the kind of idea of an eternal return and how that works. So it lends this hopefully kind of secular biblical idea to the Raincoats and this idea of coming back and eternally returning to the music and inspiring kind of new generations.
God, I love that phrase, eternal return. That's a great one. Did you make that up, by the way?
No, no.
I just thought that was a really great term. I mean, obviously, I love, these stories, and I love the narrative, and I love the fact that it adds another layer to a musical
Yeah,
narrative, which sometimes, for me, I remember not that long ago, the 80s was like just told by a few people, mostly white men. And it was like,
yeah.
oh, yeah, it was New Romantics, it was the Blitz Kids, Duran Duran, Live Aid, and that was it. And it was like, well, I can't remember. Well, that wasn't my 80s at all. And then, the stories start getting told. And
Yeah.
then, we do all the men, don't we? And then we start sort of going, oh, actually, there were women. Oh, really? I thought it was just Susie Quattro and Debbie Harry. No, it's not. There's more. So it's kind of interesting how it starts to sort of dig down. And did you find when you was doing it, did you know that there was also the member of the Dolly Mixture was also was writing her book as well at this point? Because I just thought it was quite interesting that this moment in music and two bands that they weren't they didn't probably know each other, but had a slightly similar vibe. Were sort of coming out after was it 4.5 decades? 45 years, and bringing books out. I just thought that was quite interesting timing.
Yeah, no, I didn't know that. But I think in the last 10 years, I mean, publishers have been doing a lot more work on women's histories, which is really important, and more histories of people of color and women of color, and thinking about these stories that, you know, are untold. So that probably has something to do with it. I was reading a book recently, nothing to do with music, but talking about how people often say certain stories have been forgotten or have been left untold and, aren't known. And I think and that book was talking about how it's true that just certain stories for particular reasons are unknown in kind of broader realms. And that's for all kinds of reasons, right? Depending on the story. But it's not that they're necessarily forgotten by kind of niche audiences or niche readers or knowers, but that they just need to be kind of brought out and circulated in new ways and perhaps told in new ways. And so I think that's going on too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think in the book, from memory, my memory's a bit short sometimes. You also mention is it a German band called is it Kleenex as well?
It's
That
it's a Swiss band, yeah, Kleenex. that later became known as Lilliput for legal reasons. Yeah.
Right, because I suppose I find it kind of interesting during that time, sort of eventually sort of managing to go a little bit further afield, and then sort of realizing there's this whole German sort of punk underground scene that was going on, both East and West Germany, Berlin, and so I suppose I get kind of excited when you think, oh yeah, there was these kind of little networks which and they had slight sort of, I suppose there was fanzines in this country. We had, like I mentioned, the music papers, and certain DJs like John Peel did sort of help sort of keep that going. And sort of, I think, it's a bit romanticized, but, often when you're listening to it back then, you feel like you're the only person, and you probably are almost, because the record sales are still quite small, aren't they? And you go to a gig and there aren't thousands of people, but it does have a huge meaning. And I just wonder, do you think that was what happened in the Riot Grrrl thing, that when people were looking at the music scene thinking, well, there's hair metal and there's, Poison, there's Guns N' Roses. Are people sort of looking for sort of somebody to resonate with and to be able to relate to? Was that one of the reasons why people like the Raincoats got picked up by people from Bikini Kill and such bands?
Oh yeah, definitely. They wanted feminist role models in music, right? People to show them that you can do it. You don't have to sound like us, but you can get up on stage, you can have a powerful voice, you can have a message, and you can play a role in music history. I think that was critically important. Yeah.
Yes, because it's quite interesting, because those bands are much more about politics and feminism than probably what the Raincoats and possibly
Definitely. Yeah.
the Marine Girls or the Dolly Mixture were, where they were just like, wow, we're just playing music. Isn't this amazing? And we're trying to muscle in here while getting spat at by the crowd. Punk rock. But yes, it's kind of interesting that those bands, because there's some nice little quotes and interviews you've done with Toby as well, isn't it? Is it Toby Vell?
Yeah.
And again, the Raincoats mean a lot to her and sort of her musical journey as well, which is, it's just nice when you see that kind of those legacies and those kind of the baton being passed from one kind of generation to another, and it's given another little bit of a I don't know, not a shine, but sort of meaning, I suppose, and how kind of important these little things can be, and how they can grow into a different sort of a whole nother genre and sort of scene, I suppose. That's
Yeah,
my theory.
absolutely. Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah.
Yes. And did you really, did you enjoy putting the book together, by the way? Was that a project that you enjoyed?
Yeah, I think when you're writing a book like this, you only do it as a labor of love. Yeah.
And has it gone down well, by the way? Has it sort of been kind of well received?
Yeah, I think so.
No, I've loved it. I mean, obviously, as you said, the last 10 years, or I don't know, nearly 10 years, there's suddenly been a huge amount of books that have been coming out on sort of a whole little scenes that you think, well, I'm so pleased, I didn't realize there was a market for it, but I think Mickey from Lush did her book, and then
Yeah.
various other people started writing, and there is a market, obviously, because that's what we us as a generation are suddenly wanting to read about these moments and kind of understand a bit more. And I think it's just amazing, actually. So, well, look, thank you ever so much. It's been
Oh, yeah,
amazing.
thank you.
And what do you have a new project on the go, or do you have anything that you're sort of tempted with coming out in the sort of future?
Yeah, I have a book coming out in the spring, a miniature book on Bloomsbury's new 33 and a third genre series. So it's not
Oh, how
about an album, but it's about a genre. And I'm writing a book on queercore. So that will be out in the spring, which I'm very excited about. And then I'm also working on a biography of Mark Lanigan.
And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview, or nearly, apart from the emotional goodbyes. But a massive thank you to Audrey Golden. Give me the time for that interview, talking about the Raincoats and the book, Shouting Out Loud. As I said, available from all good bookshops, also online. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on all the social media platform sites. And also, all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, and Podbean. How exciting. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.